You are the people who know this system best. You are the experts. Nobody has more credibility with the American people on this issue than you do. And so if you're willing to speak out strongly on behalf of the things you care about and what you see each and every day as you're serving patients all across the country, I'm confident we are going to get health reform passed this year.
President Obama in the Rose Garden this morning trying to get past that disastrous loss in Copenhagen with the Olympics last week and pleading some of the nation's doctors to help him get health reform passed.
50 doctors standing with the president? Right now, I think he'd rather have 50 senators. Top Line starts right now.
Hello and welcome to ABCNews.com's Top Line. I'm David Chalian.
And I'm Rick Klein.
Each weekday, we're bringing you the very latest political headlines, reporting, insight, analysis, everything you need and want to know about politics.
And you can be part of the conversation all day long via Twitter. It's twitter.com/thenote. Let us know what you think.
You've already showed you're very witty this day, so keep it up, sir. What is your top line?
White House call. President Obama meets with doctors from all 50 states to try to make the case for health care reform, wants to unleash them as something of an army, and we're seeing the latest new messaging from a White House that realizes it needs to recapture some momentum in some way. They were obviously disappointed by the Olympics last week. Afghanistan, a major issue. Health care, he's got to refocus on this in some way, and we're seeing a lot of different strategizing.
Something also that you got to give the White House credit for in terms of clever strategy today with this. They have at least one doctor from every state in the union. It's getting tons of local press coverage,
right.
Splashy, glossy stories all over the local papers across the country that they're doctors at the White House. That's not a bad idea from the White House. Like, over the filter, as it were, you know. Deadly attack. Yes, Afghanistan is still front and center and probably no more so in terms of timing this weekend because of this attack that we saw in Afghanistan. 8 U.S. soldiers killed. Rick, this attack happened in these 2 outposts where these bases were. It's exactly the kind of outpost that McChrystal is saying he wants to scale back and focus the fight in these population centers. This coming at the time while the president's deciding this strategy, it makes it the timing of the president's strategy, again, not much. Like, he's got to get this done pretty quickly.
That's exactly it. And you mentioned timing. And he has got a lot of people around him who are saying, take your time, figure this out. But events and the Congress keep overtaking that. FRIST'S flip-flop just last week. The former Senate Majority Leader, Bill Frist, made a lot of headlines by telling Time Magazine's Karen Tumulty, a good friend of the program, that he would in fact support health care reform. He said that's what leadership is all about. Well, maybe not so fast. He tells Aaron Katersky of ABC News Radio today that he's actually not in support of any of the bills, including the Baucus bill, the most conservative one out there. You get the sense that maybe he got a talking to after this.
I wonder who picked up the phone and called Dr. Bill Frist this weekend. ENSIGN'S ethics. Yes, a little more talking to, perhaps, inside the GOP quarters in the Senate. We learned that Senator Barbara Boxer, the chairwoman of the Senate Ethics Committee, has launched this preliminary ethics investigation into ENSIGN'S activities. This comes on the heels of that New York Times report, Rick, last weekend, where they went in depth and looked. It's not just that he had an affair, which he's already admitted to, and tried to help out his former aide. It's the way in which he did it and the fact that lobbying laws may have been broken and violated here. He's now sort of persona non grata inside the GOP conference. The problem is nobody's in a rush to get him out and resign because the scandal-plagued governor of Nevada is not somebody they want appointing the next senator. And I don't know that they have someone lined up that could guarantee to hold that seat in GOP hands.
They're having a hard enough time finding someone to take on Harry Reid, despite how vulnerable he is. And it may be the best thing that happens for Democrats is to keep him out there. He's a lightning rod.
No doubt about it. We're going to begin with that huge discussion about Afghanistan policy, where the White House seems to be divided among itself. And we're joined by Michael O'Hanlon of Brookings Institution. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. You know, there seem to be some basic questions that I know have very complicated answers. But one of the arguments that we hear in this debate over strategy that's going on is sort of counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. And I want to ask you, are we fighting the Taliban or are we fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And do you think that the American people have conflated those two? And how can we decouple them?
Well, it's a great question, David. You know, they are, unfortunately, closer than they used to be. And they are different, but they have been cooperating, partly because they've been geographically driven together by the wars we've been fighting for the last 8 years. But also they were allied pretty closely before. Don't forget, Osama bin Laden has sworn his loyalty to Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban. And if you read that McChrystal report that we now all can on WashingtonPost.com and elsewhere, they talk about how Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network, which is the sort of second big militia network inside the Afghanistan resistance, are cooperating more closely than ever before as well. So yes, there are differences, but the lines are blurring, and unfortunately, I think the notion that we can somehow live with the Taliban is not a very palatable one.
And we're seeing, of course, conflicting advice inside the Obama administration on what to do. Kind of an extraordinary display of major power brokers, the top general in Afghanistan, going out there and rebutting what the Vice President of the United States is talking about. Why do you think we know so much about the internal deliberations? Is it intentional? They want to show the president thinking this through, or do you think these are leaks?
Boy, that's a nice question. You know, I think it's because it's taken 3 months. I mean, McChrystal's assessment was really done by the end of July, roughly, and President Obama had other things on his plate. This is where the question of has he adopted too big of an agenda may really play. And it's just been hard to preserve some thinking space for him. Now, he deserves a little bit of that space, but you could argue he's a month and a half a little, late to the game. And he really should have been obsessing about this issue through August. The fact that he wasn't, I think, was at least a tactical mistake by the White House. You know, I'm not too concerned that this is beyond recovery, but I'm not all that impressed by how it's going right now, especially because the counterterrorism option is not the best alternative. The best alternative is a more nuanced version that tries to get the Afghans to do more as we do more, and tries to leverage our potential increased commitment to get them to get their act together.
Which makes me, when I'm listening to you, it sounds like you think they can get their act together. I want you to hear what the recently fired Deputy Ambassador from the United Nations for this region, who was going to work with Richard Holbrooke there, Peter Galbraith, said this morning on ABC's Good Morning America. Take a listen, I'll ask you on the other side.
In the absence of having a credible Afghan partner, that is to say, a government that enjoys the support of the people and is accepted by those that did not vote for the man who emerges as president, it makes no sense to ramp up. On the other hand, we cannot afford to pull out.
Well, where does that leave us, Michael?
Well, first of all, I think he's right to be very critical of the elections, and I admire Ambassador Galbraith's service. I think he was trying to hold Karzai accountable. The good news is some of the Afghan agencies are doing the same thing. And the reason it's taken more than a month to get through this process is because they are throwing out a lot of bad votes. So I'm a guarded optimist that this place winds up a little better off than it had been after this election mess is concluded. But he's right. You know, we have a conundrum. And that's why you got to figure out the way to use Richard Holbrooke's kind of Machiavellian negotiation skills to say to Karzai, listen, we're in this. But we can't go to the Congress and ask them for a redoubling of our effort yet again unless you help us take the next step. We're not asking for miracles. We're asking for a few of the worst to be fired, for some ombudsmen to be created, some accountability, some process by which citizens can complain if their local governor is stealing all the money and they know it. You just got to set up a few mechanisms that begin to take the next little chunk out of corruption. It's not going to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. But we cannot see your legitimacy erode in the eyes of your own people and have any hope. Because the Taliban are seen as the only group with any kind of real ability to deliver justice right now. And if you're in that situation, Galbraith's right, you can't be successful if the indigenous government is not stronger.
You mentioned thinking space. To what extent do the events like those over the weekend minimize that space? Did we get forced into a policy based on events on the ground?
Well, that's, it does hurt. But I also think that, basically as tragic as yesterday was, and it was so ironic that the Washington Post had the story about the same kind of attack a year and a half before as the new attack was unfolding. But this is, to some extent, really just putting all a week's history into one day. In other words, this is happening all the time out there. They're not always overrunning combat outposts, but we're losing people, as you know, every day almost. And so the idea that yesterday, as tragic as it was, has to change the debate, I don't think is true. But we have seen a bad trend now for a couple of years, and we're going to have to come up with a new strategy to reverse that. A continuation of what we've been doing is not going to work. That much we know.
Our final 10 seconds, are we going to see more troops, significant more troops into Afghanistan, do you think?
Probably, but not right away. It's going to take some time. We're going to have to get the Afghans to do more as we do more.
Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it.